Karen Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, savoring her morning coffee and mentally cataloging the neighborhood violations she'd spotted from her elevated vantage point, when she noticed something that made her ceramic mug slip from her fingers and shatter against the marble floor. Her pristine pool, the crown jewel of Willowbrook Estates, was blood red. Not rust-colored from algae or tinted from leagues. Crimson, paint bucket, fire engine, arterial spray red. Those absolute savages, she whispered, her manicured fingers pressed against the glass. 3 years as HOA president had taught her to expect rebellion, but this was warfare. She stormed outside in her silk robe and slippers, her phone already dialing the first number on her speed dial, the police. The paint had settled in swirling patterns across the surface, creating abstract art that would have been beautiful if it weren't destroying her $12,000 pool liner. 911, what's your emergency? This is Karen Whitmore, HOA president of Willowbrook Estates. Someone has vandalized my property with what appears to be several gallons of red paint. I need officers here immediately. As she waited, Karen paced her deck, her mind racing through suspects. The Hendersons at 247 Maple, whose dog she'd reported for barking. The Martinez family, whose teenager she'd cited for skateboarding on sidewalks. Or perhaps the Johnsons, whose Christmas lights she'd forced them to remove in January because they violated the community's seasonal decoration policy. The list was disturbingly long. Officer Bradley arrived within 20 minutes, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am, I understand you've had some vandalism." "Vandalism?" Karen's voice pitched higher. "This is destruction of property. Look at my pool." Bradley whistled low. "That's a lot of paint. Any idea who might have done this?" Karen's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Officer, I've been HOA president for 3 years. I enforce the rules that keep this neighborhood beautiful and maintain our property values. Unfortunately, some residents don't appreciate structure. So you have enemies. I have people who resent accountability." She crossed her arms. "The Hendersons have been particularly hostile since I reported their noise violations. Their dog barks incessantly, and when I knocked on their door to discuss it civilly, Mr. Henderson told me to, and I quote, shove the HOA rules where the sun doesn't shine." Bradley scribbled notes. "Anyone else?" The Martinez boy spray-painted graffiti on the community mailbox cluster. "When I caught him, his mother accused me of racially profiling, as if enforcing community standards has anything to do with race." Karen's voice trembled with indignation. "And don't get me started on the Johnsons. Christmas decorations in March, Karen. March. I'll need to speak with these neighbors," Bradley said, though his tone suggested he was already dreading the task. After he left, Karen stood alone beside her ruined pool, her reflection wavering in the red water. She'd moved to Willowbrook Estates because it represented everything she'd worked for: order, beauty, standards. As HOA president, she was the guardian of those values. But as she stared at the crimson mess, a cold realization settled in her chest. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a message. Someone wanted her to know they could reach her, hurt her, destroy what she cherished most. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Pretty pool, Karen. Hope you learned your lesson. Stop being such a control freak, or next time it won't just be paint." Karen's hands shook as she screenshotted the message. She'd built her reputation on being unflappable, the steady hand that kept Willowbrook beautiful. But standing there in her silk robe, looking at thousands of dollars in damage, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: fear. And Karen Whitmore had never backed down from a fight in her life. "We're not excusing the vandalism," said board member Sarah Kim, "but we think it might be time to reassess our approach. Maybe be more collaborative." Karen stood slowly, her hands flat on the conference table. "Let me be clear. The moment we start negotiating with vandals and rule breakers is the moment this community loses everything that makes it special. I won't apologize for having standards." "But Karen," Tom said, "if your approach is creating this much conflict, my approach is working. Our property values are up 18% since I became president. We have the cleanest, most well-maintained neighborhood in the county. I'm not going to let a few entitled residents destroy that because they can't be bothered to follow simple rules." The room fell silent. Karen could see doubt in their faces, and it infuriated her. She'd given 3 years of her life to this community, and now they were questioning her because someone had committed a crime. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence," said Sarah Kim quietly. Karen's world tilted. "You're not serious." "We are. All in favor?" 3 hands rose. Karen stared at them, her board, her allies, betraying her in her moment of crisis. "Fine," she said, gathering her papers. "But don't come crying to me when this neighborhood falls apart without proper leadership." As she walked to her car, Karen's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. "Saw you on the news. Still didn't learn your lesson. Last warning." Karen stared at the message, her hands trembling with rage rather than fear. They thought they'd won. They thought she'd slink away defeated. They had no idea who they were dealing with. 3 days later, Karen had transformed her dining room into a war room. Security camera footage covered her mahogany table, alongside printed emails, violation notices, and a detailed timeline of every conflict she'd had in the past year. The pool cleaning crew had quoted her $8,000 to drain, scrub, and reline the pool, money she'd have to fight her insurance company to recover. She'd interviewed every neighbor within a 3-block radius, armed with her clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Most had been politely unhelpful, but she'd noticed something interesting. The Hendersons, Martinez family, and Johnsons had all been unusually nervous. "Karen, you're obsessing," her husband Paul said, setting down a sandwich she hadn't asked for. "Maybe it's time to step back from the HOA. This is getting out of hand." "Step back?" Karen looked up from her notes, incredulous. "Paul, someone violated our home. They trespassed on our property and destroyed our pool. If I step back now, every rule breaker in this neighborhood will think they can do whatever they want. But at what cost? You haven't slept in 3 days. You're driving yourself crazy." Karen turned back to her papers. Paul meant well, but he didn't understand. He worked in accounting, where numbers behaved predictably. He'd never had to wrangle a community of people who thought rules were suggestions. Her phone rang. Karen Whitmore. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Janet Chen from Channel 7 News. We received a tip about vandalism in your neighborhood and wondered if you'd like to comment." Karen's pulse quickened. Media attention could work in her favor. "Absolutely. When can you be here?" Within 2 hours. Karen was standing beside her pool, impeccably dressed despite the turmoil. The red paint had faded to a rusty brown, making the water look like something from a horror movie. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've been HOA president for 3 years. Some residents describe you as strict. Do you think this vandalism was retaliation for your enforcement policies?" Karen kept her expression composed. "I believe in maintaining community standards. When you invest in a home, you expect your neighbors to respect shared values. Some people resent structure, but structure is what preserves property values and quality of life. We spoke with several neighbors who say you've been excessive in your enforcement. One family claims you reported them for having their garage door open too long." The Hendersons. Karen's smile tightened. Their garage door was open for 6 hours on a Saturday, creating an eyesore and potentially violating our security protocols. I attempted to address this civilly, but was met with hostility and profanity. After the interview, Karen felt energized. She presented herself as the reasonable authority figure, the victim of lawless neighbors. But as she watched the news van drive away, she noticed curtains twitching in windows across the street. Her neighbors had been watching. That evening, Karen attended the monthly HOA board meeting, expecting sympathy and support. Instead, she found herself facing a room full of uncomfortable faces. "Karen," said board member Tom Wilson, clearing his throat, "we've been discussing the recent incidents. Several residents have expressed concerns about the direction of our enforcement policies." "Concerns?" Karen's voice was dangerously quiet. "Someone destroyed my property and threatened me, and you're worried about enforcement policies?" Karen spent the next week in what Paul called tactical hibernation. She'd been voted out as HOA president, But her term didn't officially end for another month. Plenty of time to uncover the truth and prove she'd been right all along. She'd hired a private investigator named Rick Sullivan, a former cop who specialized in neighborhood disputes. His findings had been illuminating. "Your vandals aren't as clever as they think," Rick said, spreading photos across Karen's dining table. The paint was purchased at Home Depot using a credit card registered to James Martinez, the father of the skateboarding kid. But here's the interesting part. The security footage shows him buying the paint with Robert Henderson and Michael Johnson. Karen's smile was sharp as a blade, the holy trinity of rule breakers working together. "It gets better. I found their group chat." Rick handed her his phone. "They call themselves the Willowbrook Resistance. They've been planning this for months." Karen scrolled through the messages, her anger building with each screenshot. They'd documented every violation notice she'd issued, every enforcement action, every attempt to maintain community standards. They'd turned her dedication into a joke, calling her Dictator Karen and the Wicked Witch of Willowbrook. But the most damning evidence was their planning conversation. James Martinez, pool party at Karen's house. Robert Henderson, about time someone taught her a lesson. Michael Johnson, my buddy works at the paint store, got us the good stuff. James Martinez, she'll never prove it was us. Conspiracy to commit vandalism, destruction of property, criminal mischief, Karen said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. "Rick, I want you to take this to the police immediately. Already made copies for Officer Bradley. They'll be arrested this afternoon." Karen felt the satisfaction she hadn't experienced in weeks. Justice, finally. But as Rick left, Karen realized her vindication felt hollow. She'd been right about the vandals, but she'd lost her position, her board's support, and probably her neighbors' respect. The community she'd worked so hard to protect had rejected her. Her phone rang. Paul, calling from his office. "Karen, I just heard from Tom Wilson. The arrests are all over the neighborhood social media. People are saying you orchestrated some kind of sting operation. I found the criminals who destroyed our property. I'd hardly call that orchestrating. But Karen, 3 families are being torn apart. The kids are crying. The wives are devastated. Maybe you proved your point, but at what cost?" Karen hung up and walked to her window. Across the street, she could see police cars at the Henderson house. Mrs. Henderson was crying on her front porch while her children watched from inside. For the first time in weeks, Karen felt a flicker of doubt. She'd been right, completely, legally, morally right. But being right felt different than she'd expected. Her doorbell rang. Karen opened it to find a woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged, professional with kind eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Detective Lisa Park. I wanted to speak with you about the vandalism case." "Of course. Please come in." They sat in Karen's living room, the detective's presence somehow making the space feel smaller. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've made the arrests based on the evidence you provided. The case is solid, but I have to ask, was there any possibility of resolving this conflict before it escalated to criminal activity?" Karen felt defensive. "I tried to address violations through proper channels. They chose to respond with vandalism and threats. I understand, but looking at your violation history, you've issued over 200 citations in 3 years. That's significant. I maintain community standards. I'm sure you do. But 3 families are now facing criminal charges, and a neighborhood is divided. I've seen this before. HOA conflicts that spiral out of control until everyone loses." Detective Park leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, you were legally right to pursue this. But I have to ask, was it the right thing to do?" After the detective left, Karen sat alone in her pristine living room, surrounded by the fruits of her 3-year campaign for order and beauty. The silence was deafening. Her phone buzzed one final time. A text from an unknown number. "You won, Karen. Hope it was worth it." Karen stared at the message, then at her reflection in the darkened window. She'd won. The vandals were arrested. The evidence was overwhelming, and justice had been served. So why did victory feel so much like defeat? Outside, the first news van pulled up to her curb. By morning, she knew the whole city would know the story of Willowbrook Estates and its iron-fisted HOA president who'd sent 3 families to jail over a paint-filled pool. Karen Whitmore had spent 3 years building a reputation as the woman who wouldn't back down from a fight. Now she was about to discover what happened when you won every battle but lost the war.